Okay, so this is going to be part 1 for Chapter 3 lecture series. And what we're really wanting to cover here is the different ways in which we could allocate goods and services within society. So what are the different allocation systems that we could use? And then we want to identify why we use the system that we do. So there's a few different ways that we could go about allocating goods and services in society. Number one, we can just decide to have the government decide. So just have a government-run system. Usually what comes to mind here would be socialism, some political system where the government is basically dictating who gets all of the goods and services, how resources are used, yada yada. The second system that we could use could be perhaps a lottery system. Just put everybody's name in a pot. If your name gets pulled, you get the good or service. A third method that we could use would just be first come, first serve. So again, whoever gets there first gets the goods. And the last allocation system that we could use would be a market system, right? Where everybody uses their income to purchase the goods and services. Whoever has the money is able to buy the goods. All right, so let's look at each one of these, and more specifically, what are the incentives that are created by each one of these systems? So think of the government system. If the United States government was the one that was going to decide who got what in society, right? Determine the amount of goods and services that you are allocated, what would be your incentive? What would you want to do if you were living in a society that the government dictated who got what? Well, I'll tell you the incentive that comes to mind for me. Work for the government or be friends with somebody that works for the government. In other words, that increases my chances of having the opportunity to have more goods and services allocated to me. So that is the primary incentive that is going to be created, is just to be close to the government, whether that be working for them or being friends with somebody that works for the government. Does it create any incentive to economic growth? Not necessarily. In other words, I'm not going to want to work any harder. I'm just going to work at getting close to the government so that I can get more goods and services. Then we have to ask ourselves, is this fair? Well, not really. In other words, if it's the government who's deciding who gets what, then it's not taking need into account, and we can't assume that goods and services are going to be fairly distributed. The government is going to decide who they want to give the goods and services to, and it's probably going to favor those that work for the government or are friends with the government. The second allocation system that we have would be a lottery system. So of course, all you can do is hope your name gets pulled. Does this create any kind of incentives? Not really. There's absolutely nothing you can do to increase your chances of getting more goods and services. You just have to hope that your name gets pulled in that lottery system. Does this system seem fair? Again, no. It does not take need into account. Now, if I had to pick one of the four, which is the most fair, if we had to pick one, I would say the lottery system, because the lottery system gives everybody equal opportunity to get the good or service. Nobody in society has a better chance than anybody else because everybody's name is just put into the lottery one time. So again, it's equal in terms of your chances of getting the good, but that still doesn't make it fair. The third allocation system that we could use would be just a first come, first serve basis. So we want to look and see again, what incentives does this create? Well, I'll tell you, the incentive that I would have would be to get up early. In other words, get there first. So if goods and services are going to be allocated based on first come, first serve basis, then the only incentive it creates is for me to get up and be the first one there to ensure that I get the good or service that I desire. Again, is this fair? If we just say, hey, Just show up, whoever gets there first gets the good. No, we wouldn't say that's fair either. What happens if you're disabled? What happens if you live far away from the pickup location? In other words, again, this does not take into account the needs of the individual participants in the society either. So this one is also not fair. And then the third system that we have would be the market system, and that is the system that we currently operate in. And a market system is where we use our limited income to buy the goods and services that are produced. So those that have the most money get the most goods and services, basically. So again, we want to look at what incentives does this create? If we decide to allocate goods and services based on a market system, does this create any incentives for economic growth? And we would say absolutely yes. In other words, it makes me work more and or harder, right? Because the more I work, the more money I get, right? And so if I know that the more money I have, the more goods and services I will get, then it's going to want to make me work more. The more people in society work, the more output is produced. The more output that's produced, the more economic growth is going to take place. So the market system is the one system that creates the incentives that are necessary for economic growth. People now have an incentive to want to work and produce more because that way they can generate more income for themselves, which allows them to buy more goods and services. Now, is a market system fair? No, just like the other three, a market system is not fair either. It's not necessarily take needs into account. It's just at the end of the day, whoever makes the most money is going to get the most goods and services. So it's not fair either. And we understand that as economists, that at the heart of a market capitalist system, there's going to be inequality. But out of these four allocation systems, it is the only system that we have that creates the incentives necessary for economic growth, which is why we use it. So now that we know why we use a market system, let's go ahead and define it. And I have the definition right here on your lecture slide. A market, by definition, is just a place where buyers and sellers come together and set prices and quantities. So in other words, where goods and services are exchanged. What are some examples of markets that you can think of? In other words, any place where you go and you willingly exchange goods and services for money, that would be an example of a market. So one example of a market may just be like a grocery market, right? Another example of a market you could say would be the stock market. Now, a market does not have to have a specific geographic location. In other words, think of something like eBay. In other words, that's a market. People willingly buy goods and services on the internet. So it doesn't have to have a specific geographic location. What about the guy on the corner selling drugs? In other words, and a market can be illegal. In other words, if people are willing to buy that good or service, then that is considered a market. So a market does not have to be legal. Markets can also be illegal in nature. So again, anything that you think of where, buyers and sellers come together and willingly, participate in that exchange for that good or service, that is an example of a market. And markets can be local, national, or international. So like a local market may be an example of like a farmer's market, right? In other words, I know up in Tehachapi during the summertime, local farmers, local producers, every Thursday will go to the city square and sell their goods and services. So that's a market that only exists on a local level. But you can also have goods and services sold on a national level, right? So again, think of something like a grocery store like Albertsons. They also sell produce products, the same that are sold at a farmer's market. However, it's done on a national level. Those farmers then have sold their goods and services to the grocery stores, which then ship them all over the United States. And then, of course, it can exist on an international level also. In other words, maybe we're buying produce from other countries. So, anytime you're buying something that is made in another country, then that's going to be a part of the international market. And in some markets, they overlap each other. In other words, some markets can exist on a local, national, and international level. Now, before the modern market, where we use money to buy goods and services, in order to make an exchange, what people did was barter. So whenever there's an exchange of goods and services where no money is used, then we call that bartering. And so the early days of market systems, this is exactly what would occur. Now, the problem with bartering is that you have to have what's called a double coincidence of wants, which is basically saying what person A wants, from person B has to want what person A produces. So in other words, they both have to produce what the other person wants. So it causes the cost of the transactions to increase, because now you have to find somebody that A produces the good that you want, and then B actually wants what you produce. So let's say I happen to specialize in producing apples. The only way that I can trade with anybody is if somebody else actually wanted apples. So again, you can see that it may be more difficult for me to engage in a market transaction because I have to find that double coincidence of wants. Most modern markets are going to involve money rather than bartering, because again, it's much easier to just produce a good or service and then sell it for money, because everybody is willingly going to accept that as payment. Now, when we are participating in the market and we are examining the prices of goods, we want to make sure that we understand when we examine the price of goods, we tend to refer to them as relative prices. Relative prices are the price of one good expressed in terms of the price of another good. So I have the definition right here on the lecture slide. So when you make a purchase with money for a good or service, you forego all other goods and services you could have purchased with that money. So again, when you're deciding between good A and good B, what you're doing is comparing the relative prices in relation to how much you want or need that product. They also allow us to establish values of goods and services relative to each other. So think about a market transaction where we were going to barter, right? So let's say that Joe sells apples and Anne sells oranges. And they're going to exchange apples for oranges, right? Well, before they can make that exchange, they have to figure out the relative values. In other words, how much is one apple worth compared to one orange? Will Joe give Anne 2 apples for every 1 orange she gives him? Will they just exchange on a 1-to-1 ratio, 1 apple for 1 orange? In other words, they have to figure that out. We would consider that a transaction cost for this to take place, that they have to sit there and figure out how much is 1 apple worth compared to 1 orange, right? So in other words, that's what would happen if we were bartering. In the modern market, relative prices do that for us. We wouldn't have to figure out what an apple is worth relative to an orange. So if I go to the grocery store and I see the price of apples is $1 a pound, and I see the price of oranges is $2 a pound, I can compare and I can see that oranges are twice as valuable. They're worth twice as much, right? Because oranges are $2 a pound and apples are only $1 a pound. I don't need to sit there and figure out what is the value of one relative to the other. The prices do that for me, right? I can see that oranges are twice as much as apples, therefore their value is twice as much. So again, relative prices of goods and services basically affect all of our economic choices that we make. We're constantly comparing relative prices when we are making purchases in the market. So I can give you an example like this, and you would be able to determine the relative prices of the two goods in relation to each other based on their prevailing market prices at this time. So according to this problem, it says a basketball is priced at $12 and a sleeve of 3 golf balls is priced at $6. Therefore, what is the relative price of one golf ball in terms of a basketball? Well, if 3 golf balls are $6, but we just want to know what is the relative price of one golf ball, then we just need to divide that 6 by 3, and we see that one golf ball is worth $2, right? So if a golf ball is worth $2 and a basketball is worth $12, then that would mean that if we, plug those into our equation here, 2 divided by 12, that means that one golf ball is worth 1/6 of a basketball, right? That's what those prices are telling us. It allows us to determine the relative values of goods and services in relation to each other. So of course the correct answer here would be C, that the relative price of one golf ball in terms of a basketball is 1/6 of a basketball. So from that we can derive that a basketball is worth 6 times as much as a golf ball, right? So now we ask ourselves, why? Why is it that a basketball is worth so much more than a golf ball? What is causing it to cost 6 times as much? And what we do in a market system to answer that question is use demand and supply. We believe it is the demand for a product in the market in relation to the supply of the product in the market that dictate these relative prices, that dictate why the price of a basketball is $12 versus $2 for a golf ball. So in this next part of the lecture series, we will be going over explicitly the demand side of the market.